Margaret Bennett had always believed in the quiet strength of family. At 63, with silver hair that caught the morning light and lines around her eyes that spoke of a lifetime of smiles, she thought she knew her children. She thought she understood the life she'd built. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Margaret stood in her kitchen, sunlight streaming through lace curtains, preparing coffee in the home she'd lived in for 30 years. The house her late husband, James, had promised would always be theirs. The house where she'd raised Daniel and Emily, where birthday candles had been blown out and tears had been dried. She'd been feeling lonely lately. James had been gone for 5 years now, and the silence of the house sometimes felt too heavy. So she'd asked her children a simple question the night before, during their weekly phone call. "I was thinking," she'd said softly, "maybe I could come stay with one of you for a week, just to visit. I miss you both." The pause on the other end had been brief but noticeable. Daniel, her son, 35 years old with James's serious eyes and quick mind, had responded first. "Mom, we need to talk about that. Can we come by tomorrow morning?" Something in his voice had made her stomach tighten, but she'd agreed. Now, watching them walk up the driveway together, Daniel in his business suit, Emily in her teacher's practical dress, Margaret felt that tightness return. They looked like they were coming to a meeting, not visiting their mother. She opened the door with a smile anyway. "Come in, my loves. I've made coffee." They sat at the kitchen table where they'd done homework as children. Emily wouldn't meet her eyes. Daniel cleared his throat twice before speaking. "Mom," he began, his voice careful, measured, "about your request to stay with us. We've discussed it, Emily and I, and we think it's not practical right now." Margaret's hands stilled on her coffee cup. "Not practical?" Emily finally looked up, her voice defensive. "Mom, we're not running a charity. We have our own lives, our own families. Daniel has his work, and I have the kids and my teaching. We can't just drop everything." The words hit like a slap. "We're not running a charity," as if asking to visit her own children was begging for handouts. As if she were a burden, not their mother. Margaret felt something crack inside her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "I see. Of course. You're both very busy." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "We knew you'd understand, Mom. You've always been reasonable." They left 20 minutes later, their coffee barely touched. Margaret sat alone in the silence, staring at the 3 cups on the table. The third one, hers, was the only one empty. And then, slowly, carefully, she began to think. For the next 3 days, Margaret moved through her house like a woman cataloging memories. She opened every account statement, every deed, every document James had left in her care. She'd never paid much attention to the details. James had handled the finances, and after he died, her lawyer had helped her organize everything. But now she looked with new eyes. The house, fully paid off, worth $700,000 in the current market. The savings accounts, the investment portfolios James had built carefully over 40 years of work as an engineer. The trust fund he'd established for the grandchildren's education. The life insurance payout she'd never touched. All of it in her name. All of it hers to do with as she wished. Daniel and Emily were the sole beneficiaries in her will. They would inherit everything: the house, the money, the carefully preserved legacy of their father's hard work. Everything they'd been counting on, perhaps. Everything they thought was already theirs. Margaret made herself a cup of tea and sat down at the kitchen table with her laptop. Her hands trembled slightly as she typed, but her mind was clear. By Friday morning, she had made her decisions. The lawyer's office was warm and smelled of old books and leather. Margaret sat across from Robert Chen, who had handled James's estate and had known their family for 20 years. "Margaret," he said gently, reviewing the documents she'd requested, "are you certain about this? It's comprehensive." "I'm certain, Robert." The changes were simple, but absolute. The house would be sold upon her death, with all proceeds going to the children's hospital where she'd volunteered when Daniel and Emily were young. Her investment accounts would fund scholarships for underprivileged students. The trust fund for her grandchildren would remain. She wouldn't punish children for their parents' coldness, but everything else, every dollar, would go to charities. She'd carefully selected organizations that helped the elderly, the lonely, the forgotten. Organizations that treated people with dignity, not as burdens. Daniel and Emily would receive nothing. I'll inform them by letter, Margaret told Robert. They should know. That's your right, Robert said quietly. Though I suspect it will come as quite a shock. Margaret thought of Emily's words. We're not running a charity. Yes, she said softly. I suspect it will. She mailed the letters on Saturday, along with copies of the new will. She imagined them arriving on Monday. Imagined Daniel and Emily opening them at their breakfast tables. Would they call? Would they come rushing over, apologetic, suddenly available? Margaret wasn't sure she wanted to know. Sunday morning, she made herself breakfast and sat on her back porch, watching birds gather at the feeder James had built years ago. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and approaching winter. Her phone rang at 9:30. Daniel. She let it go to voicemail. It rang again at 10. Emily. She let that one go to. By noon, she had 12 missed calls. At 2 o'clock, both of them were at her door, their faces pale and anxious. Margaret let them in. She offered coffee again, poured it herself, sat down at the same kitchen table. Mom, Daniel started, his voice tight with panic. We got your letter. You can't be serious. You can't just give everything away, can't I? Margaret's voice was calm, almost gentle. It's my money, Daniel. My house. Your father left it to me to do with as I wished. Emily's eyes were red. But we're your children. We're family. Family, Margaret repeated softly. She looked at her daughter, this woman she'd nursed through fevers and heartbreaks, whose children she'd babysat every Thursday for 3 years. Is family a charity, Emily? The silence was crushing. Mom, we didn't mean it like that, Daniel said, but his voice lacked conviction. Margaret set down her cup. When your father died, I was alone for the first time in 40 years. I learned to balance checkbooks. I learned to fix the garbage disposal. I learned to sleep in an empty bed. I never asked you for money. I never asked you to solve my problems. All I asked was to visit, to spend time with the people I love most in this world. And you made me feel like a burden. We were just being practical, Emily whispered. Practica, Margaret said. Yes, I suppose you were. And now, being practical too. I'm ensuring that what your father and I built goes to people who need it, who will appreciate it, who understand. That kindness isn't a transaction. Daniel's jaw clenched. So this is revenge? Punishment? No, sweetheart. Margaret's eyes were sad, but clear. This is clarity. You showed me who you've become, and I believe you. I'm simply acting on that information. She stood, smoothing her dress. You're still welcome here anytime. You're still my children, and I still love you. But my estate will go where it can do the most good, to organizations that treat people with dignity. That's final. They left angry, confused, hurt. Margaret watched them go from her window, feeling the weight of what she'd done settle over her like a heavy blanket. But beneath the sadness, there was something else. Something that felt oddly like freedom. 3 weeks passed in quiet. Margaret volunteered more at the community center. She took a painting class. She had dinner with her friend Patricia, who'd been widowed around the same time, and they laughed about the absurdity of adult children who forgot their parents were once young too, who had dreams too, who had feelings too. On a Thursday evening, her doorbell rang. Emily stood there alone, her eyes uncertain. Mom, can we talk? Margaret let her in. They sat in the living room this time, not the kitchen. Emily twisted her hands in her lap, searching for words. I've been thinking, Emily finally said, about what you said, about how we made you feel. And Mom, I'm ashamed. You raised us better than that. Margaret waited, saying nothing. I got caught up in my life, Emily continued, tears starting to fall. My job, the kids' schedules, Tom's stress at work. I stopped seeing you as mom and started seeing you as another obligation. And that's horrible. That's not who I want to be. Why are you here, Emily? Because I miss you. Really miss you. Not your money or your will or any of that. I miss my mom. I miss your stories about Dad. I miss how you always know when I'm pretending to be fine. I miss being your daughter, not just someone managing your existence. The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Margaret's eyes softened. I miss you too, sweetheart. I know I can't undo what I said, Emily whispered. I know the will is yours to do with as you choose, and honestly, after how Daniel and I acted, I understand why you changed it. But could you? Would you let me try again? Let me be the daughter you deserved all along? Margaret reached across and took her daughter's hand. You're here now. That's a start. Emily nodded, wiping her eyes. Could I visit this weekend? Just me? I could help you with the garden like we used to. No agenda. Just time to get in. I'd like that, Margaret said softly. Daniel came 2 days later, his apology less eloquent, but no less sincere. He admitted he'd been thinking of the inheritance as something already his, something owed, and that perspective had poisoned how he saw his mother. He asked if he could take her to dinner once a week, just to talk, to listen, to be present. Margaret said yes. The will remained unchanged. She'd made her point, and more importantly, she'd made her peace with her decision. What she left behind would help people who society often overlooked, just as her children had overlooked her. But the relationships? Those began to heal. Emily visited most weekends, bringing the grandchildren. Daniel called every Tuesday evening, and they talked about everything and nothing: his work frustrations, her painting class, memories of James, plans for the future. They never discussed the will again. It had ceased to matter. On Margaret's 64th birthday, both of her children surprised her with a weekend trip to the coast, to the little inn where she and James had honeymoon. They walked on the beach together, 3 generations, and Margaret felt her heart full in a way it hadn't been in years. Thank you, she told them that evening, as the sun set over the water. For what? Emily asked. For coming back. To me. For seeing me again. Daniel hugged her, this serious man with his father's eyes. Thank you for not giving up on us, Mom. For showing us who we'd become and giving us a chance to be better. That night, lying in bed and listening to the ocean waves, Margaret thought about revenge and love, about betrayal and redemption. She thought about how sometimes the strongest act of love is holding up a mirror, even when the reflection is painful. She thought about how she'd started this journey angry and hurt, how she'd wanted them to understand what they'd done, and somehow, impossibly, it had worked. Not because they wanted the money back, though she suspected that had been Daniel's initial motivation, but because the shock had cracked something open in both of them, had forced them to examine who they'd become. They'd looked in that mirror and hadn't liked what they saw. So they'd changed. Margaret fell asleep to the sound of the waves, a small smile on her face, her heart fuller than it had been in 5 long years. The money would still go to charity. That decision stood as a reminder, a monument to a moment of truth. But her children had come back to her, and in the end, that was worth more than any inheritance could ever be. 2 years later, Margaret sat in her garden, Emily beside her, both of them with dirt under their fingernails from planting tomatoes. Daniel was inside, helping his son with homework at that same kitchen table. The house was full of life again, full of love. Margaret had learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is truth, even when truth is hard. That sometimes you have to be willing to lose everything to show people what really matters. Her children had learned that their mother wasn't a fixture or a future inheritance, but a person who needed love just as much as anyone else. That family isn't obligation, it's choice, made new every day. And together, they'd learned that redemption is possible, that relationships broken can be mended, that it's never too late to become the people you were meant to be. The silver-haired woman in that image, with wisdom in her eyes and strength in her bearing, had taught them all one final lesson. Love isn't charity. It's a gift, freely given, worth more than any inheritance, and it's never, ever too late to come home.